All right. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Jen in Nevada.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for, like she said, taking time out of your days and nights to join us. I know in the last, 6 years, there's been never-ending changes to the standardized testing landscape, and this year is, no different. So I'm here today with Nevada. I'm the founder and CEO of Great Expectations, and Nevada is our test prep guru. So he knows all the ins and outs of SAT and ACT and kind of speaking to you about some of the differences where I'll be speaking about the broader landscape and kind of how it's playing a role in college admissions and all of those angles. So on that note, I think this is the first thing when people ask, do standardized test scores matter these days, right? There's so many test optional schools. Do we want to take this seriously? Should we be putting time, money, and energy into standardized testing? Look, at a certain point, it depends on where you're applying to school. But I think the important thing is to understand there's a study that came out, the Opportunity Insights study, and you can see just a little graph here from their study that basically shows that you have a much higher correlation between your SAT or ACT score and how you will do in college than what your GPA was in high school, how you do in college. So you can see if you look along the yellow line, it's like looking at those data points, kids with 1600s did better in college as looking at the GPA than people who had 1200s. And high school GPA, yes, there was correlation, but the line of best fit's not it's not too severe or too extreme. So when the study came out, the study was done by people at Brown, MIT, a number of schools, and this came out in 2023. And then by 2024, there were all these changes to who was test optional, who's suddenly requiring again, who was blind and then went to optional. So, but this is the study that shifted things after COVID, right? After COVID, it was mainly test optional schools everywhere, and this started to shift. So, understanding where schools are, but depending on what year you are, this can change. If you're in ninth grade, if you're in 11th grade, this is going to be different, right? There's no guarantees this is going to stay the same. But as of now, test blind schools are the ones that do not consider testing, right? So even if you've got a perfect 1600 or a 36 on the ACT, they're not going to look at it. You can't send it. That it's a very regional thing. It's a lot of West Coast schools, right? And there are schools like the New School and some on the East Coast or elsewhere, but the majority are kind of it's a very California's saturated, even just the West Coast broadly. You look at Reed and some schools up further north. But so understanding that there are some test blind schools, they're not as many as I think people expected. The UCs and Cal States are kind of the bigger schools that are still not considering scores, which is crazy when you realize that many of them have more than 150,000 applications a year. To try to weed through those without test scores is tough. Test optional is still very much a thing. So, you look at GW, Vanderbilt, Rice, Wake Forest, SMU, different, levels of competitiveness for the schools, but the same sort of perspective, which is if testing benefits you, include testing in your application. If testing does not benefit you, then don't worry about it as much. One way I like to look at this is that if you are applying to a test optional school and trying to decide whether or not to submit scores, think of it as your GPA. If your GPA is significantly above that university's average, so say they have an average 3.68 GPA, right? And you have a 4.2, your test scores are going to have to be really high to do anything other than bring down your GPA because you've already proven academically you're significantly above average for these schools. But if it's the other way around, say they have that 3.68 and you're 3.4, they're going to want to look at test scores that are higher than average to try to balance that out. Now, of course, if you can be amazing at both, even better. But don't think of optional as do I want to? Because I think a lot of people are like, well, I don't really want to test, so we won't do it. I want you instead thinking of, will my application be as strong as possible without it, or do I need to balance something in my academic kind of records? Okay, test flexible is very unique, to be honest. Yale and NYU are two of the better known schools that do it. There are others, but it's not common, and I honestly don't know how long it will last. The idea is they want some standardized testing. So it doesn't have to be SAT or ACT. They can take a couple AP scores and see how you've done, but as long as it's a standardized exam and test of any kind, they'll consider it. So again, not something I would count on for years to follow, but you never know. Tests required, this number is getting higher. So where this shifted after that study is you went from all the IBs being test optional to now more than half of them are required And of the other four, there's, I think, two that are going next year to required and leaving a couple that are optional. Only one saying that they'll stay optional. But who knows? Again, everything's shifting so fast. But then you also look at state schools in a lot of different states, right? You can look at, I mean, UT Austin, I think will also end up influencing other colleges because they were one of the first big boys to fall. But then you also have all the, like, University of Tennessee, all the Georgia state schools, all the Florida state schools. You can see Purdue, right? But then obviously the MITs and Stanfords of the world. So with these schools, you have to have a score. So, back to the title of this webinar, if to test or not to test, you have to decide where you're applying, how much time and energy you have, what your priorities are. But if you want to apply to Stanford or you want to have a shot at UT Austin, for instance, you need scores and they have to be reasonably good. The optional, by the way, for kids who are applying to a list, let's just say your whole list is test optional. A lot of students will end up sending whatever their scores are to two-thirds of their colleges, right? Maybe they're good enough for their safeties and targets, but their reach schools wanted a little higher than they were able to achieve. So we leave it as optional for the more competitive schools. Everyone's different, but I think understanding that if you're ninth or 10th grade, cannot predict where this will be when you apply, but it is moving back towards required or strongly recommended, which just means that you want to have options. So planning on taking the standardized tests, planning on having a score in your back pocket that you can use where you need to is always a good idea. If testing is like a horrific weakness for you, you not only hate it, but you're never, ever, ever going to do well, you may then need to consider maybe your list is just limited to the test optional and test blind schools. There's amazing schools out there that fit those categories. And even if that list shifts, it's still always going to have a lot of great options. But today, we're obviously going to talk about those of you who are planning on moving forward with testing and keeping those options open, which is always definitely what we're recommending. So one thing with PSAT that I think is important to clarify, because I think there's definitely some confusion around this, is that if you are taking it, so as a junior, so you can see the note here, the 2026 PSAT, so I guess if you're a sophomore now, you'll be a junior in the fall, so you'll take this in usually mid-October. The scholarship awards don't come around until 2028 because then they're making their decisions in 2027, semifinalists, finalists, etc. So the reality is that the PSAT for the 8, 9, or 10 for 8th, 9th, or 10th grade, it has no bearing on anything. It's literally you learning what the SAT is like and taking a practice test in a kind of real informal environment and getting a sense of where you're at. In 11th grade, right, in junior year, it does qualify you for the National Merit Scholarship Program. So looking at that, if this is your only official route of entry, right, you have to do this to be eligible, but also understand that you have to really be in the top test takers. So this is something where I just like to break this down number-wise so you understand when it matters. So people ask, should I be prepping for the PSAT? Does the score matter enough? We should put time, money, and energy into this. Look, if you're going to be in the top 1, 2% of test takers, absolutely. Then it's definitely worth doing. It'll flag you. You can put, at that point, you might be a semifinalist when you apply to colleges. That's great, right? And you would be able to tout this, and colleges love being able to say we had this many, National Merit Scholars or finalists coming in our new class. However, look at these numbers. So this is assuming roughly 1.5 million people take it a year, which is about right. 50,000 even get any recognition, right? Then you get 34 out of those 50,000 are commended. The semifinalists are about half of that. Most semifinalists become finalists. There's a check of like grades and have you gotten into trouble or had any issues on your record. And then of those finalists, about half are winners, right? So you're roughly 7,200 people out of 1.5 million that this really matters for. I mean, I guess if you're even commended or semifinalist, we might put it on your applications, but they care for college, they care about your SAT or ACT score. The PSAT score will not be listed anywhere. This would just be a nice honor or award. And of course, if you end up with the scholarship money, amazing. But keep in mind, being in those, the 7,250 kids who actually win a scholarship, great. But for everyone else, it's just something you list on the application as an honor or an award, right? So just remember, colleges don't see these scores. So I would say if you're looking to minimize stress and prep time, because this also comes up a lot. If you decide you like the ACT better, a lot of kids are like, well, then I'm not prepping for the PSAT. That's fine, right? You can take the ACT. If you really think you could be in that top 1 or 2%, then amazing. Let's have a conversation about prepping for the PSAT. but I would rather you pick the SAT or ACT based on which test is better for you and not worry about prep for PSAT. So, anyways, that's my 2 cents on PSAT. But I'm going to let Nevada take over for the official SAT and ACT and kind of walk you through how these tests work.
Thank you, Jen, and hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Nevada Ryan. I've been in the test prep space for 12 years now, and as Jen said, the test prep guru here at Great Expectations. So happy to explain some of this stuff to everyone. So take a look at this table here, some big picture differences that I'd like to go over. And then we'll get into some more detail about the specifics in each of the sections that make these tests different. So let's take a look at the top. So the first part, the format, SAT since 2024 has been a strictly digital test. So the way it works is students take their own personal laptop into the actual testing center. They download the Blue Book application, and then as they're taking the test, it just locks and they can't search the internet or anything like that. You can also get a loaner computer if necessary, but you'd have to do that for, I'd say, about 30 days out at least before the test date. Other than that, strictly computer test. ACT, by contrast, is a computer test, but it's also paper and pencil as it's always been. Um, so I would say right now, as far as what we know about the two computer versions, the SAT is much better at its computer version than the ACT so far. But I'm sure ACT is getting better. I know they're adding some new features, every day now or every few months or so. But for now, I think we tend to recommend paper for the ACT. As far as content goes, so big picture stuff. SAT is adaptive. I'm going to explain more about what that is in the next slide, so I'll just table that for the moment. And then the ACT is not adaptive, or it's what's called fixed form, so everyone gets the same test. As far as the structure of these exams goes, the SAT has a reading and writing section. There's two modules for that. You get a short break. Then there's a math section, two modules for that, and then you're done. 98 questions in total. Whereas the ACT, you've got your English, math, reading. So those are the what they call your core sections. Those are kind of the mandatory ones you have to take. And then you get a short break in between math and reading. You get another break between reading and science if you end up taking the science, but as you can see here, it's optional. This is a new feature they rolled out for, I'd say, about a year now. So the new test that's officially new ACT version that's been out the last year has been called the enhanced ACT. And so with this new version, your score is basically the average of those core sections, and the science section is optional. So you don't have to take it. Moving down to calculation and how these scores how your scores are calculated. So the SAT's questions are actually weighted differently depending on difficulty. Now you might ask, how do they do that? What is that process? Very boring, complicated psychometric explanation I won't give you, but they use something called item response theory, which basically weights a question based on a variety of things. One could be how difficult it is, how likely how possible it is for someone to have gotten it correct just by guessing, all kinds of details like that. So anyway, they're not weighted the same, but the range is either 10 to 30 points. So there's no smaller gradations than that. It's either 10 points or as much as 30. Um, and as far as the overall score goes, so each section is worth anywhere between 200 and 800 points. And so your total SAT score is just the sum of those. So if you just wrote your name, you'd get 200 points for each section, and your total would be 400. As far as the ACT goes, those questions are weighted equally. So every question is just 1 point. It's not as if you get more points or fewer points if one is harder or easier. It's the same thing across the board. Their scoring scale is out of 36. So if you got a perfect, you get a 36. If you, again, just wrote your name in each section, you'd get a 1. Um, and then as far as the composite score, I mentioned that a moment ago, that's basically your total official ACT score. That's going to be the average of those three core sections, English, math, and reading. And then science is a separate score. So when you get your score report on the ACTs, or if you go into your student account, you'll see your composite score, the individual scores, and then science is just off by itself. Okay, last item here on the slide is just the total time. So 2 hours and 14 minutes for SAT, 2 hours and 5 minutes for ACT, or a little bit extra if you are taking that optional science section. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit of a break in between. So those total times don't include the break. That's just the actual time that you're taking the test. Um, okay, so adaptive testing. So this is something that people have a lot of questions about, particularly when the SAT first changed. So basically, what happens is everybody gets the same first module, and that's going to have a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions. And how a student performs in that first module is going to determine if they get an easier or a harder second module. Now, then you might be asking, okay, well, what's the criteria for that? How does that work? So you need to get, it kind of depends on, again, which specific questions you're missing or getting correct, but it's somewhere around 2/3 of the section of the module, excuse me, that you need to get correct in order to qualify for the harder one. Now, you might ask, well, why wouldn't I want the easier one? It's going to be easier, right? Well, the answer to that is you're basically, you give yourself a ceiling at that point. So if you get the easier second module, and even if you ace that easier second module in each section, the highest you can get is somewhere around a 600, maybe low 600s, high 500s. But we did an analysis of the first few tests that came out back when the um, when the tests first switched to digital, and that was basically the number we got. It was somewhere around 10 to 11 questions, again, give or take, depending on the test, depending on the specific section, and that would be the most you could get incorrect to still qualify for the harder one. So any more than that, and you get kind of bumped down to the easier second module. Last thing I'll point out is that this is not a question adaptive test. So some people think, oh, if I get the first one question, wrong, the next one's going to be easier, or if I get one question correct, the next one's going to be harder. It's actually not that granular. So there are some standardized tests like that. I think I listed here the GMAT, but this is not like that. It's just basically the whole section. So it's not nearly as complicated as some people might have been hearing online. So okay, we can move on to the next one. Okay, so getting some more details here about the differences. So I'll start with the SAT. The SAT basically puts their reading comprehension and grammar punctuation stuff all in one section. So the first half of that SAT reading and writing section, as they call it, is your reading comprehension stuff. And then the latter half is going to be your English grammar, reading, punctuation type topics. The reading section stuff is interesting. So they used to have long essay passages, just like the ACT currently has, and they moved away from that. So now they have shorter passages. So the range I put here is about 25 words to roughly 150, and it doesn't really get longer than that. So you might think, well, that's kind of nice. I have fewer words to read. It's not that much to think about. And that's true. Sometimes it actually is a little bit easier to comprehend the whole thing. However, I will say that they actually can be very, very difficult. Much more difficult than I would say, reading like a whole ACT passage. So there are some differences. So some students like to think, well, it's shorter. I just have a paragraph. It's not that hard. And sometimes that's true. Other times it's definitely not true. Um, in addition to that, you're getting diagrams and things. So I'll talk about that in a moment when we get to the science section. But there's definitely some things to consider other than just how short it is. And then last thing I'll say is this discrete passages are discrete. So what that means is you have one passage and there's just one question with it, and then you answer that and you just go on to the next one, and that's gone forever. So it's not as if you have multiple questions to answer about the same passage. So that's how the ACT works as far as the reading writing section goes. For the ACT, they have distinct sections. So there's an English section that has your grammar, and then there's a reading section that has your reading comprehension. So the passages are a bit longer. I would say the reading stuff is much more like a basic reading comprehension test. This is kind of stuff that students would see on a regular school test or other standardized tests they might have taken. This is like very typical. You read a long-ish passage. I think the range I have here is 750 to 850 words. Basically like a magazine article or something, an excerpt of a novel, and then you're answering 9 questions about it for the reading one. And either 5 to 10 for the English section. So this is more of a typical kind of reading comprehension or English language test, I would say. The passages themselves are longer, but they're not as difficult, I would say. So you might think on the one hand, if reading a long passage on something that's uninteresting is difficult for you or difficult for your student, that's one thing to consider. But overall, the passages are not too dense. The questions aren't too bad. It's more about comprehending it generally and moving through that section quickly. Um, let's see, last takeaway, as I said,
I'm too fast for you, Nevada. Sorry.
that's okay. I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything
No,
there.
you're good. You're good.
I actually, oh, then the more straightforward, I guess I kind of touched on that. Yeah. So there, it's longer. So again, you might be kind of, students might be intimidated by longer passages, but overall, they're actually not as, overall not as dense. You're not really getting anything that's too bad. Every once in a while, a little bit, but there, it's more about, again, can you do it quickly and can you just read the essay and answer some questions about it? Okay, we can move on to, I think, math. Yes. All right. So for SAT, this is heavily focused in algebra. It's about 70% of the test is algebra, and then the rest of the test would be about maybe 15% or so is geometry, trigonometry. Another 15% is what's called problem solving data analysis. So this is going to be probability, percents, interpreting graphs, things like that. But it's the bulk of it is going to be algebra. So polynomials, linear functions, parabolas, graphing, that kind of stuff. Um, they've got a Desmos calculator that's built into the app. So there's a ton of stuff to do there. The tutors that we have on our team know of all the hacks. We've had people write blog posts about it. We've got stuff in our curriculum about it. So it's kind of a fun feature that really unlocks some cool things that you can do with the math section and make some of the questions easier to answer, faster to answer. So it's definitely a new, I'd say, standardized test feature that there's a lot to learn about, and that we're still learning about more every day. The questions themselves for the SAT overall, the math section are going to be a little bit trickier, more abstract, a little more of like a problem solving. I like to say I sometimes feel it feels like almost like an IQ test kind of puzzle. But there's also a broad range of them in the sense of difficulty. So there's some questions that are kind of very Mickey Mouse, and there's some that are super wacky, and there's just everything in between. Um, let's see, as far as one thing to consider, it would be, how good are you at math? Because math is half your score. So something to think about for the SAT. If you are strong in math, then that's something that you can definitely that's going to work to your advantage. Whereas if it's not your strongest, then that's a place where it's going to be difficult to hide a poor math score. Let's see, takeaway there, Desmos graphing calculator and more time per question, but could be offset by, like I said, some questions could be more difficult. They kind of have that logic puzzle feel to them. ACT, okay, let's move over here. So I like to say it's broad but shallow. It's basically just like a little bit of everything you've learned from like junior high all the way to senior year. So pre-algebra all the way up to a little bit of pre-calc, a lot more geometry than what's on the SAT. Um, and they do allow you to have a calculator the entire time. If you're going to use the computer version, they are now offering Desmos as well. So that's something to consider. That's a pretty recent development, I'd say around January or so that they announced that. Um, I'd say as far as the more details in terms of the content, the questions are phrased a bit more directly. They don't have that as abstracty logic puzzle type feel. Much more straightforward. It's much more about can you, again, answer these questions, testing topics you've learned from, eighth grade or so, all the way to end of high school, and can you do it relatively quickly and nimbly? That's kind of the main thing. So more of a fast-paced obstacle course, I like to call it. And okay, science. So for SAT, it doesn't have a dedicated science section. There's no science ACT section, but we made this a topic because there's a lot of science in the ACT. And a lot of people think, a lot of students think, well, if I don't like science, if I'm scared of it, if I'm bad at it or whatever, yeah, I'm just going to do the SAT. So made this section to address that. This is a concern I've heard a lot. So the thing is, they smuggle science topics into the whole test. So the reading writing section has some very, very difficult questions that are just totally laden with science topics, chemistry, biology, astrophysics, very, very difficult topics that uh, are testing your reading comprehension, but it's also science. Now, you don't need to technically bring any background science knowledge, but if you do have it, it might make some of what's being described a little bit easier to understand. So there's a lot of that in the reading writing section, so beware. And then as far as the math section goes, I mentioned in the previous slide, there's that problem solving data analysis section. So that does have sort of statistics. It does have some research methodology, experimental design, drawing conclusions from certain, studies and so on. So there's definitely some kind of scientific, fluency that needs to be that you need to have to succeed there as well. So takeaway is going to be if you're scared of science, you're not going to fully avoid it by taking the SAT. As far as ACT goes, so as everybody knows, there is its dedicated science section. It is optional now. So you actually don't have to take it. And even if you do, it's not factored into your composite score. So that's gives some students another reason to maybe stick with the ACT then because they're not scared that the science score, and if it ends up not being good, is going to drag down their average. So this is basically a graph and chart speed reading test. Very little actual science knowledge that's required. Maybe, 3 to 4 questions that'll ask them things from junior high type knowledge, maybe order of the planets from the sun, pH level, things like that, but nothing too detailed as far as background knowledge goes. So it's much more about interpreting data, interpreting graphs, interpreting experiments, spotting trends, things of that nature. So much more of a fast-paced table, graph, chart, speed reading test than it is a science test, but definitely still its own dedicated section. Okay, last slide here, just some kind of other big picture differences I wanted to let everyone know about. So the ACT, I'll start with that one. ACT does this thing called ACT My Answer Key, used to be called the Test Information Release report. And basically, it's a few select test dates a year. Students who take the official test, get the opportunity to pay, it keeps going up every year. I want to say it's maybe 30 or something now, 30, 40. But you pay $30 and you actually get a PDF copy of the official test that you took. And you get to see all the answers you selected. You get an answer key, so you see what the actual right answers are for each question, and you can see, oh, I picked B, I was gonna pick A, and that was the right one, So you can kind of see, what you did right, what you did wrong, and it's really an invaluable study tool for students who are planning to study beyond, to keep tutoring beyond that. Keep prepping beyond that same test date. So that's a great feature that the ACT has. Whereas the SAT doesn't have that. It used to have something like this. It was called the question and answer service. Doesn't have that anymore. Instead, you basically get, I mean, practically nothing. It's this thing called the knowledge and skills report. And really, it just has a list of these broad content domain categories. And it'll just kind of have bars filled in. So if you did well in that section, all of the bars will just be black. And if you kind of, missed a couple questions, one of the bars will be white. But it really doesn't tell you much. It's a very kind of low resolution score report. So All that's to say, for studying purposes, one, I think, point against the SAT is that they don't have something like this. And I've spoken with people at the College Board, and they've told me there's no plans to bring this back, the question and answer service back. So we just kind of have to deal with what they've got. Whereas the ACT does have that feature, so that's great. Um, Now, on the other hand, SAT does have something that ACT doesn't, which is they've got thousands of questions on their question bank. So that's actually something that's very helpful because there's tons of practice material. So um, we use that stuff in our curriculum here. It's straight from College Board, and it's great practice because it's stuff that's like straight from the company. They also have 7 tests on their Blue Book application. So again, they've written official tests, and you can go take them and get a full score report. You can see which ones you missed, so that kind of stuff is helpful. ACT is actually a little bit weaker in this area. So right now they've only got 5 full tests. There's one partial one, and I'm calling that partial because when they give you back the test, this for the ACT My Answer Key, they don't show you the unscored questions. So there's several questions in each section that are missing. And then the best thing to study on top of that, or after all of that, is going to be the older tests. So we call these in the industry the legacy ACT. So these are just the older ones. And the good news is they're actually it's the same content. It's really the same reading passages, same math topics, same English grammar stuff. It's basically just the newer test is just a different format. So we do have a lot of those, but if you're trying to time yourself and trying to see exactly how you're going to do, it's a little difficult to use those. So those are some trade-offs there in terms of study materials. And then final thing I'll say, just big picture stuff. People always want to know which one's harder, easier, better. What do you think? And so my opinion is in these 2 paragraphs here. So, and I kind of mentioned this earlier with the math section, but SAT requires more like critical thinking, problem solving, kind of analytic stuff. And again, I said this earlier, it feels more of kind of like a logic puzzle IQ test. Like not always, sometimes it is just a straight, you know, math test. I mean, can you do this algebra problem or something? Some of them are pretty straightforward, but they do get to a point where they get this feel that I think you don't see in the ACT. Overall, ACT is more like what's called an achievement test. It's kind of like high school exit exam almost. Like, can you remember everything, or at least, a good percentage of everything that you've been taught over the last few years, and can you do it pretty quickly? That's kind of the main difference I would say between the two is that you've got this more kind of critical thinking, logic feel with the SAT, whereas ACT does have much more of like an achievement test, kind of high school exit exam feel. But there is a ton of overlap as well. I think I mentioned earlier the English grammar stuff, very similar. A lot of the math is also there's the algebra stuff definitely overlaps as well. So they're not, totally night and day, but also many differences as well. So I think that'll do it for the differences.
That is it. Thank you so much, Nevada. I appreciate that. It's a lot.
Sure.
And it does leave me one thing that I should have mentioned too when we talk about test optional and all these different things. The science section for ACT, this is also shifting because this is a new option to not take science. So the fact that ACT is making it optional, not all colleges are making it optional. So there are some colleges that are still saying you have to take science. We like it the old way. We want all of it. And then there are other schools that, especially some tech schools, that are saying we don't even care about it, even though you would think for a tech school, doesn't matter. Some of them show value to certain sections other more than others. Every school you apply to, whether you're doing this on your own, with us, with someone else, with your school, you should be researching the policies for every college on your list and just know that they're not all going to have the same standardized testing requirements. So if you're taking ACT, we always recommend do it with science. And then if you don't do well on science and your schools don't require it, great, you leave it off. That's totally fine. Um, okay, so the timeline for SAT, ACT, this comes down really to where you are in math and also kind of if you're doing, I mean, there's also a ton of factors like are you an athletic recruit? Are you trying to do, recruitment, which moves up the timeline? We want test scores a little sooner. Do you play a spring sport or a fall sport? Like there's a lot of things we could talk about. But at the end of the day, let's say you are, we'll work backwards. We'll say senior year, you're taking Algebra 2, right? This is going to be challenging because all of a sudden there's still Algebra 2 on both tests. You're going to have a tough time. So then it's like we need to have you take it at the end of junior year, beginning of senior year, acknowledging that there's going to be big gaps in your math. However, most kids, the standard kind of track that you're on is the Algebra 2 as a junior. And if you're doing that, then you can see here that you still want to be done with most of Algebra 2, but we generally would recommend where it says third sitting. By the way, this does not mean you take it 4 times necessarily. It's kind of just that these are where that kind of there's fall, winter, spring sort of idea. But looking at those spring dates junior year, we usually tell our kids in Algebra 2 in 11th grade, you want to start refreshing yourself on all the other math, right? All the grammar rules in the English language that are fair game, all the reading strategies and pacing and things like that. You want to start that prep so that come the end of junior year, when you're done with Algebra 2, you can jump into testing June through, September, October. Do be careful of the fall dates senior year, just to kind of throw this out there. They don't have to get you your scores back for 2 months. I think usually it's 8 weeks is kind of when they are required to get it back to you. It's usually 10 to 14 days, depending on the test. But the reason I bring this up is that if you're applying for November 1st deadlines and you take the October sitting, you should for sure get your scores back, but for sure isn't for sure, right? So statistically, the likelihood is that you'll get them back in time, but there's no guarantees. And if you're counting on those scores for your November 1st deadlines, you might be out of luck. So I always try to have my students done by August. September is like last resort in my mind. Now, if you're applying for all regular decision schools, you have the fall and then the deadlines aren't till January, then that's different. But now let's talk about if you're moving ahead in math and let's say you're in Algebra 2 as a sophomore. I would love to have any sophomore I work with, I have take the dual diagnostics, which means one SAT, one ACT with us. We sit down, we look at why they're missing what they're missing, which test kind of plays to their strengths, minimizes their weaknesses. And then they start prep ideally over the summer at the end of sophomore year. And then they prep through that summer, early fall, but they start testing in the fall, all the way fall till winter. And by winter break, hopefully you're done. So let's just say you prep from June to July or August, you take a September date, then you take, sometime October and December, you're hopefully done. The goal is that second semester junior year is free. If you are done with Algebra 2 in 10th grade, it makes your life a lot better because you have APs, you have finals, you have all the stress of college stuff looming on the horizon. So trying to be done by halfway through junior year is great. Now, for those of you who are exceptional at math and are taking Algebra 2 in 9th grade, gets a little bit murkier. So this is where it depends on your drive, your desire to do this or not do this, because you don't want to wait too long. So even though you've covered what needs to be covered, and yes, there are some questions that might come from stats or pre-calc, there's only a handful, right? And generally we could just fill in those gaps when we work with those students. But also if you just finished freshman year of high school, you've got a lot of time to learn and see where you're at. So usually, again, I would have my students take the diagnostics. Let's see where you're scoring at the end of 9th grade once you've learned 95 to 98% of the math that's on the tests. And again, by the way, you're not usually learning grammar in high school in America these days. You've either learned it or you haven't. You might learn a couple of things, but if who versus whom hasn't come up at some point, you're probably not going to learn it suddenly in junior year. So the idea is like, what have you already learned? Where are you? Because I will say, of my kids who've taken Algebra 2 in 9th grade, I'd say at least a third of them are done in first semester of 10th grade with standardized testing. Because they're just good testers, part kind of goes hand in hand with being so bright that you're taking Algebra 2 in 9th grade. But if that's the case, then it's up to you to say, like, do I want to push and just get it over with? Or do I want to wait maybe till the second half of 10th grade? The concern with waiting until junior year is that if you've learned everything you need in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, really maybe even 6th grade, you now have a gap and it's stuff you haven't learned in a while. And I see some of my best students they don't remember how to add fractions because they haven't done it in years, right? It's the basic fundamental stuff you learned far too long ago. So try to avoid there being a big gap between Algebra 2 and actually starting your standardized testing. And again, also try to avoid fall of senior year. You can see also part of that is that you are doing all those essays and applications, so you don't want more on your plate if you can avoid it. Okay, so these are the dates for this year. Every year is give or take. I mean, it's obviously not identical, but you can look at ACT and it's usually, you've got a February and April, a June, July, September, like the months are generally the same. So usually you can see SAT is a little bit more variety, but ACT is almost always the second date of that month, sometimes the third. It just depends. But anyways, you can kind of look at these and figure out, do I have a track meet on one of these days? Am I out of town for one of them? And it should actually change how you prep. We do recommend taking 2 to 3 for official tests. Look, if your first score is perfect, we let you off the hook. But let's say you're, aiming for top schools, regardless of where you are on that first test date, you can fine tune. And a lot of schools allow you to do something called super scoring, which means you could take your highest math from one test date, your highest English from another test date, right? And if you're doing ACT, your science and reading. So you could be mixing and matching from multiple test dates. So I always say, look, something could get better on that second date. And SAT allows for super scoring as well. But after 3 test dates, because the magic number is usually 2 to 3, there is less improvement, right? It becomes more marginal gains and you can plateau. And so if you're just looking at it as like, well, I can take it half a dozen times, there are some schools that want to see all of the scores that you have. You don't look sane if you're submitting 13 SAT scores to colleges. So we don't want them knowing that you've taken this. Most colleges say submit the best score or the super score, but similarly, even with the super score, if each section's from a different test date for ACT, they know you took it at least 4 times. So try to get it done in 2 or 3. And look, if you can knock it all out in one test date, amazing. Or if you, improve a little bit, but sometimes somebody crushes math on the first try. So then the next test date, we focus prep more on the English and reading and science if they're doing that. But that's up to you. But I think looking at these dates sometimes helps, because if you realize, well, I can't even do 2 of the fall dates, we wouldn't want to start prep in the summer if you're not free. And let's say we're doing ACT in September and October dates, you're out of town or you have conflicts. We don't want to start prep in June or July, right? You're going to have a huge gap before the next test in December. So whenever we sit down and say, this is the right test for you, here's the plan, we look at it and make a kind of a roadmap for the standardized testing that lies ahead and how you're going to space it out and keep your sanity in high school while you do that. All right. So for those of you who have accommodations, or are thinking of applying for accommodations, this is kind of just fundamental basic stuff. And this is starting to change a little bit. SAT and ACT, we'll talk about that in a minute, that they have slightly different rules and understandings of accommodations, but they're shifting every once in a while. And so you'll see a nuanced difference here and there. But the big things that you should know, regardless of which one you think you're taking at this point, you're going to need some sort of neuropsych or educational evaluation. So whether it's done by a private doctor, whether it's through the school, and then a record that requested accommodations have actually been implemented. This is a bigger factor because there are families who get the, accommodation documentation from a doctor and go, sweet, now my kid gets 50% more time on the SAT or the ACT, but the ACT is going to look at it and go, but you don't use 50% more time at school, so you clearly don't need it. So they want to see that you've actually implemented these, and they will want, a length of time to show that you've actually kind of committed and need this and this has been in place. So if you're thinking about accommodations, because I have some families who are like, well, let's just see how high school goes. If you think you want them or need them, really more need them, apply sooner rather than later, because then you have had them in place. They've been implemented longer, and you're more likely to actually get approved if this is a path you're going to go down. So the key facts to consider also is that ACT and College Board, totally separate companies, totally separate processes, timelines. I have people all the time who say, well, SAT approved me, so I'm sure I'll get approved for ACT. That does not mean that. They have different processes, and we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. But understand that you have to apply separately. Again, totally unrelated companies and processes. So you would have to apply twice, because I do have some students who are like, look, if I don't get accommodations on one test and I do on the other, I'm going to take the test that offers, again, usually it's like extended time. It could be 50%, 100%. For some kids, it's, computer use for something that wouldn't have other been computer use, but now that's more common anyways. Sometimes it's about not having to bubble. If you're using the paper exam, it's being able to circle in the test booklet. There's a lot of different types of accommodation, so it's not just about time. The other thing is that colleges will not know if you took the exam with accommodation. So I have parents who are worried about colleges seeing that, yes, they got this great score, but they required 50% more time to get it. Colleges will never know. So that is considered, on the medical health, there's a very big wall there that they're never going to know what type of medical accommodations you needed. Students should be aware that extended time accommodations do make the test quite long. If it would hurt more than help, consider that. This is the irony, right? So if you have ADHD and you're struggling to sit still for that 2.5 hours for the test, and then you're like, great, let's make it 50% longer, right? Or twice as long if you get 100% time. It's long. And so just be aware that sometimes for some kids, powering through is actually better and easier, but it completely depends on the kid. By the way, there's also multi-day testing for ACT. That's still a thing where you could take English one day, math another day, reading another day. Again, hard to get very specific accommodations for specific diagnoses, but that's my point is there's a lot of different things based on it. So don't assume what you may or may not get and fight for what you need. And if you have somebody who can advocate for you, it makes this a lot easier. Okay, so being more specific, let's talk about ACT. So they need all of the testing to have been performed within the last 3 years. And then if it's for visual impairments or psychiatric disorders, 1 year. So this can't be from third grade, right? They want things that are more updated. They want things that are going to prove to them that this is a recent or still ongoing challenge. If you go to a private school, this is one thing that I think is important to know. So you have to have had the full year. We talked about having those accommodations implemented. ACT wants private school kids to have it in for at least a year. And it says anecdotal evidence suggests on rare occasions after only 3 months, that's super rare because this has shifted. It used to not be the case, but they have decided that there's enough people gaming the system, and especially people who can afford to go get that neuropsych evaluation done in a certain way, who oftentimes are at private schools, who are going to advocate for their students and say, sure, if you need this, we're good. You just want to be careful that, yeah, if you just have a neuropsych eval for the first time junior year and suddenly get it, they're not going to give you accommodations generally right off the bat. So use your accommodations, get them implemented, use them. Don't say I got them, but I don't ever use them in class. If you're a public school kid, though, as long as you have the accommodations on file, they're not looking at for how long it's been implemented or has been on file or when did you do it and not as much. They care more. They're going to grant the accommodations to match your schools. But again, they still want them to be implemented, not just on record, but if they're on file, they're going to trust public schools. ACT just trusts that, IEPs and 504s are a much more standardized kind of process of, A than B. So they accept those more readily. SAT. So they let you go a little bit further back. So you remember ACT was 3 years. This is only 5 for SAT. And then visual disabilities as 2 years instead of 1. So they're letting you go a little bit further back in time if you've had this. But again, I would check because I have some kids who are like, well, I had it right before middle school. I was like, well, I would really do the math then on when you're planning on taking the test. So then if you have evaluations of medical or psychiatric conditions that affect testing, it must have occurred within the year before the request. So that has to be fresher. So that's the one thing where ACT was lumping that in with visual disabilities. SAT is putting it in its own category and saying this needs to be more recent. So waiting as long as possible to apply for accommodations after these tests are completed and your school grants them is great. But if you can't, SAT is looser with accommodation approvals. I always joke that's because it is, like Nevada said, a little bit more like an IQ test and a little bit trickier. So they're kind of like, knock your socks off, get 50% more time. Like it's still going to be a challenging test. ACT, because it's more direct and straightforward, but moves at a slightly faster clip, they understand that more time on ACT generally can be a greater gift. So that's why they're a little bit more stringent. College board accommodations can take as long as 7 weeks. If you go through the school, it's generally faster. But this is the other thing is if you're going to try to take, let's say right now, you're planning on a test in a month or two, you're pushing it depending on when you get all the paperwork in, because there also can be an appeal process. There are times when they'll reject it because they didn't have certain documentation, but you can either call or depending on the letter they send you, they might tell you what they're missing or you might be able to call and figure it out. But talking to your doctors, your schools, usually if you really genuinely need something, you can advocate for yourself and appeal and get that. But again, even if they did approve you, if you get a rejection in the first week, that appeal process is going to take several weeks to gather things. So don't wait. Get everything done as quickly as possible and as far in advance as you possibly can. Okay, that is it. We tried to kind of keep this as concise as we could for you today. So hopefully this was helpful. I know we have a bunch of questions. So Lauren, you want to jump in, and then Nevada, feel free to jump in on any of these as well.
Yes, thank you both. First question is, should we hire an expert to help us through this process?
This person was planted. I love this person. Yes. I mean, look, if you can afford it, if it's an option for your family, it is a great thing. As Nevada mentioned, there's a lot of resources and you can look back at old tests. I think the challenge is that a lot of kids, if left to their own devices to study, this is all material they in theory have learned. So if they're not scoring a perfect score, it's oftentimes not about the material itself. It's about how the questions are being asked or pacing or the strategy for, elimination. So that's where professionals come in, whether it's us or whether it's someone else. I think being open to the fact that it's about how you're approaching the test differently, not just do we need to teach you, parabola, whatever, parabolic functions, like then that's a different issue. But yes, I think having somebody to guide you through it does make it easier, and especially to make sure you're taking the right test. Because I think the other big weakness I see when kids do it on their own is they might take a practice SAT and ACT to decide which test. They pick the one where the score is comparatively slightly higher, but maybe it was a difference of one or two questions. It doesn't mean they're going to do better or that test is better suited for them. Oftentimes, kids do better on SAT because they've already seen the PSAT. They've seen other exams that are similar. ACT can sometimes be foreign because you haven't seen a test laid out that way. But the moment you review it, you start to understand it was actually much simpler than you thought it was. So again, whether it's us or other professionals, I would say if it's a possibility for your family, it's great. I think there's kind of three different types of prep you can look into. You can look into like kind of the big classroom, group settings that are large where you're being kind of talked at. It's not a bad thing, but it's also oftentimes if you're in a room with 30 kids after school, on campus, you're going to find yourself, they're talking to the lowest common denominator a lot of times, right? The kid who's always raising their hands. It's not as effective. It's still definitely better than nothing. Then there's small groups. So like we offer one that's a group of up to 5. And then that's something that you can get your friends from the soccer team or from wherever, just, people have the same general schedule and abilities. Say, hey, we're free on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? But then you have a smaller group where it's much more higher engagement level and they're teaching to kind of where you're at. Or you can do one-on-one, which of course, that's where you're going to see the most impact the most quickly, but it's obviously going to be more expensive as an option. So it just really depends on your situation.
Thank you for that. And I love this next question. It is, what are the gotchas? So, for example, in the past, it was better not to answer a question as a wrong answer. What do we need to know in relation to this or other unusual marking criteria?
Nevada, you want to try to take this one? Like what? Remember back in our day, it was negative 1/4 of a point on the SAT
Yeah.
if you got something wrong. Anything?
Um, yeah, so I would say, I mean, you're not penalized for wrong answers on either test. So, in theory, the easy advice is just bubble something in. I mean, there really can't go wrong with that. I would say for the SAT, it's a little harder for some of the math questions because there's a free response question, so you actually have to type it in. So, what I've told some of my students, and depends on the student and what their strengths are, um, is to just do those first, and that way you can spend a little more time on them, and then if you run out of time you can at least bubble something in for the free response, or excuse me, for the multiple choice ones. Whereas if you're running out of time and the last question is one that it requires for you to type it in, you're not going to guess it, right? So that's yeah, that's something to consider as far as allocating your time. But yeah, that's all I have to say about that. I'm trying to think of anything else. Jen, you got anything?
Not much. I mean, I think one thing I always tell kids, and this is definitely an art, not a science, is that if you're, on a section on, let's say ACT, where it is just, multiple choice, there aren't any free response type questions. I would say like look at your answers. Like if you have ACT, by the way, has, A, B, C, D, and then F, G, H, J. So it alternates, which is meant to make bubbling easier. But I say, look, how many do you have in column A, which is going to be AF, AF, AF? How many in second column, third column? I was like, maybe you don't have that many in the third column, which would be CH. So if you have to bubble the last 5 randomly because you're running out of time, pick the CHs. Then we see we had fewer of those. But of course, if you were wrong all at the beginning, that goes out the window. But yeah, trying ways that are just kind of strategic things to maybe help you get an extra couple points here and there. But they did, luckily, neither test, like you said, has anything to do with like there's no more penalties for getting something wrong. Because I remember back in our day, that was more terrifying of deciding if you wanted to leave it blank or if you wanted to try. That's out the window. So I think that's about it. Lauren, what else you got?
Yeah, I know we're getting close on time. So I think we've got time for one more. The next one is, do PSAT scores count towards possible college merit money?
Good question. So only for the National Merit Scholarship Fund. So if you apply for that and you win it and you're in that 7,250 kids who, win a scholarship, yes, the answer is yes. But remember, out of 1.5 million kids, give or take. So It is possible, but you're not going to use your PSAT scores for any other scholarships. Your actual SAT or ACT scores will be the things you submit for whether it's merit money at the colleges or universities you're applying to, whether it's, outside scholarships that want you to use scores, it would not be PSAT. So I think there's so much focus on the PSAT and national merit that people are really kind of fixated on that. Try to break that because it really is, it's a great thing and it's good exposure to the test, but it really for 98, 99% of the kids, you're not getting even any recognition. So it's not as worth it. But yes, you can get lots of good money from lots of places with your actual scores, not your PSAT scores.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you did not get your question answered, please feel free to email us after the webinar. We'd be happy to tackle those later. And then you've got on your screen the information to reach us via email and by phone, and also to set up a complimentary consultation with Jen if you would like to. She is always happy to talk and answer questions afterwards also. All right, I think that does it as far as our end goes. Nevada and Jen, thank you so much for your time this evening. And for everyone else who joined us tonight, I hope you have a fabulous evening.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.